On the deck of the slave ship Zong, a chilling silence gripped the air. The winds howled, pushing the ship relentlessly through the stormy Atlantic. But the rough seas weren't what haunted those aboard. No, it was something far darker, a sinister act that would scar history forever. The date was November 29, 1781. What was about to happen on this ship would become a tale of greed, cruelty, and unimaginable horror, one that still echoes across the centuries. This was not a story about survival, but one about profit, where human lives were mere numbers in an equation, a ledger of misery. The question remains, how could such an act be justified? How did the world respond to one of the darkest episodes of the transatlantic slave trade? The Zong wasn't just any ship. It was a floating prison. Beneath its decks, over 400 enslaved Africans, men, women, and children, were chained together, packed into tight, suffocating quarters. It was a sight of despair and hopelessness. With every day that passed, the enslaved were dragged further away from their homes, their families, and their freedom. The stench of sickness hung in the air, and the cries of the chained echoed in the hull, growing weaker as their spirits withered under the oppressive heat and filth. At the helm was Captain Luke Collingwood, a man with little compassion and even less regard for the lives in his control. To him, the people below were not human. They were mere cargo, bodies to be bought and sold for profit. But even this cargo had become an inconvenience. The journey had gone off course, and the crew had made several critical mistakes. As the days stretched on, water supplies grew alarmingly low. They were running out of time and out of resources. Too many souls on board, too little water, and the destination still distant. But Collingwood wasn't thinking about the survival of the people on board, not the Africans. His mind was focused on another calculation entirely. You see, under the brutal laws of the time, if a slave died of natural causes, the ship's owners suffered the financial loss. The value of the enslaved person would simply disappear. But if those same slaves were thrown overboard, deemed a casualty of the voyage, the insurance would cover the loss. It was all about money. In Collingwood's twisted mind, the equation was simple. Throw them into the sea, a massacre masquerading as a necessary sacrifice. And so it began. Over the course of several days, 142 enslaved Africans, men, women, and children, were shackled, dragged to the ship's edge, and tossed into the ocean's depths. The crew called it an emergency. Some of the victims were weak, ravaged by illness and dehydration, while others were still strong enough to resist, but none of that mattered. The chains they wore sealed their fate. The crew was cold and methodical, their hearts hardened by greed and the normalization of such horrors. They watched as human beings were discarded like refuse, men, women, and children, their bodies twisting in the air before they were swallowed by the depths of the ocean, their lives snuffed out by the cold, indifferent sea. But for those still chained below deck, the horror was even worse. They heard every splash, every desperate scream. With each one, they knew their time was coming. The terror was palpable, the darkness closing in. How long before their chains were unlocked, not for freedom, but to face the same watery grave? Here's the most chilling truth of all. There was never a need for it. When the Zong finally reached its destination in Jamaica, it was discovered that the ship had more than enough water all along. This wasn't about survival. It was about profit. A horrific massacre, carried out for the sake of money, all while the water supplies remained sufficient to keep everyone alive. Imagine being thrown into the ocean not because you were dying, but because your death could line someone's pockets. Word of the atrocity did not remain confined to the waters of the Atlantic. When the Zong docked and the story reached English shores, it sparked outrage, but not the kind you might expect. This wasn't about justice for the murdered slaves, at least not initially. Instead, the outrage arose from the legal battle that ensued. The ship's owners, greedy merchants with a cold disregard for human life, filed an insurance claim for the slaves that had been thrown overboard. They argued that the massacre was necessary, a justifiable loss, to save the rest of the ship's cargo and crew. Their goal, to recoup the value of the lost lives through insurance money. But the insurance company refused to pay. They suspected something wasn't right. What followed was a court case that would expose the chilling details of the slaughter and shake the moral conscience of the public. Yet this wasn't a murder trial. No one was standing trial for the deaths of 142 innocent souls. This was a cold, emotionless dispute over money, a legal question of whether these lives were lawfully discarded. In the first trial, shockingly, the court ruled in favor of the ship's owners. They upheld the notion that these enslaved people were property, no different from any other cargo on the ship. And just like damaged goods or spoiled supplies, they could be disposed of without consequence. But this wasn't the end of the story. The Zong Massacre became a rallying cry. One voice that rose in protest was Granville Sharp, a prominent British abolitionist who had long campaigned against the slave trade. Sharp was outraged, not only by the brutality of the massacre, but by the legal system's endorsement of it. Alongside other abolitionists, he seized on the case as proof of the inhumanity of the slave trade, spreading the story far and wide. Another key figure in this rising resistance was Olaudah Equiano, a former enslaved African who had purchased his own freedom. Equiano had lived through the horrors of the Middle Passage himself, enduring the cruel conditions of a slave ship. His first-hand experience lent him the credibility to speak out, and the Zong Massacre ignited his passion for justice. Equiano, Sharp, and other abolitionists used the case to expose the monstrous reality of the transatlantic slave trade. They published pamphlets, gave speeches, and rallied the public to demand an end to this barbaric system. The image of 142 men, women, and children being thrown into the ocean became a powerful symbol of the dehumanization at the heart of slavery. The massacre was no longer just a legal issue. It became a moral one. A growing number of people began to see the enslaved not as property but as human beings. And as the story spread, so did the movement to end the trade. The Zong Massacre was a grotesque illustration of the brutal nature of the slave trade. But it was also a turning point. The outrage it sparked helped fuel the abolitionist movement, a movement that would gain unstoppable momentum in the years to come. But how did this one event, this horrific massacre for profit, turn the tide of history? How did the memory of those who perished aboard the Zong transform from a crime for financial gain into a symbol of resistance and a rallying cry for justice? The answers lie in the years that followed as the fight for abolition gained strength, leading to the eventual passage of the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act in 1807. But the legacy of the Zong Massacre didn't end there. Even after the trade was abolished, the fight for justice and equality continued, with the memory of those lost at sea serving as a constant reminder of the horrors of slavery and the need to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. The Zong Massacre may have been an atrocity born out of greed, but it also ignited a movement that would forever change the course of history. The fight for justice, equality, and the abolition of the slave trade was long and hard fought, with the memory of those 142 lives fueling a cause that eventually triumphed. But the story of the Zong is just one chapter in a much larger history of human struggle, survival, and resistance. Thank you for watching Escape Files, where we dive deep into the untold stories of history, tales of courage, tragedy, and the enduring human spirit. If you're captivated by stories of prison escapes, war heroes, and historical mysteries, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to never miss an episode. We're here to bring you the most gripping stories that deserve to be remembered.